Well, my intro to this talk would be that we're living at some pretty exciting times for people that are in the dairy and the meat business. How many people in here have heard of the term conjugated linoleic acid, alias CLA? A few of you? Oh yeah, a few of you. How about long chain alpha omega-3 fatty acids? More of you. Okay. Well, this is a whole new paradigm movement in meat and milk, and the good news is that it's suited most for biological livestock people. In 1985, the first international symposium on long-chain fatty acids was put together, whereby they came through with the benefits, the health benefits of the long-chain alpha omega-3, the EPA DHA fatty acids that are found in the fats of ruminants on grass. In 1996, the first proceedings papers on research, and there has been over 200 research papers now published and ongoing on conjugated linoleic acid, CLA. And this is real exciting because CLA now has been discovered to be the most potent anti-carcinogenic food compound known to man. When they did laboratory experiments with these animals, they couldn't even induce cancer with laboratory animals that had been given CLA. And again, the good news is that the only availability of CLA is in ruminants on grass. Merely by feeding 15% of the dry matter intake to ruminants in the form of grain puts you right back to the conventional meat. And CLA in these animals is anywhere from 500 to 600% higher. Now, the significance of this, of course, economically, is now you can look at a whole nother value-added aspect to growing grass-fed, biologically raised mutton, lamb, veal, beef, dairy products, because believe me, with the healthcare crisis implosion and the recognition that foods are intrinsically medicines and that certain components are more valuable than others, then you're going to recognize the fact that you don't really have any competition because the feedlot industry can't produce this stuff. And that's great news. Alpha omega-3 is an essential fatty acid. You're going to hear all about the cardiovascular components with alpha omega-3. I'm going to talk about those tomorrow relative to the myths associated with why we have such an epidemic of cardiovascular disease as it relates to inflammation, and how these alpha omega-3 long-chain fatty acids are so significantly anti-inflammatory. And then the CLA issue is just astounding. I mean, they're just finding new things on and on and on. So what I'm going to be talking about is back to the future, because in the days of some of the research projects that were going on in these farms that I'm going to illustrate in these upcoming slides, they didn't have names for these things, but they did know that these components from animals on grass that were on biologically mineralized soils produced incredibly unsurpassed health benefits. This first slide, that's right, I can't use this. This first slide is a slide that I got out of a book. One of my bad habits is going into used bookstores and trying to find old agricultural books because in about 25% of the time you find some pretty amazing research exhibits. This was one of them. Those of you that have been in the dairy business and those of you that drank or ate dairy products probably heard of Carnation Dairy Farms. It was the top dairy herd in the world at one time, started in 1910. And this was a ration that was put together for their top cow in the herd in 1952, 50 years ago. And what this tells you is that this herd, now this today, 42,000 pounds of milk, by your comparisons, is like 20,000 liters of milk. That's an enviable record by anybody's measuring stick. And this is 50 years ago, supposedly when they had inferior genetics. And if you look at what they've got up here, you'll see that this is a high forage ration. Down here, we're only feeding a whopping 20 pounds of grain for this 1,500 pounds of butter fat, 42,000 pounds of milk. Absolutely astounding. More interesting than that is the fact that they had 135 cows in the herd that were over 1,000 pounds of butter fat. So this wasn't some fluke. This wasn't a freak cow. This is something that they figured out. And I looked at this and I thought, how in the heck did they do this? Because pasture was their first and most important consideration. In fact, the second chapter of this book is called Pasture, the Profit Maker, and that grasses contain the lactogenic factors as you can call them here. Beet pulp, you can see there, hemicellulose and cellulose and some pectins. Not a lot of corn silage. You feed herds feeding twice to 3 times that today with half the production. Sliced beets, that's the mangle beets, which again, really high in those pectins, which are, I'm going to talk about those in some detail. A lot of hay, 20 pounds to 40 pounds, depending if it was a winter or summer ration. They fed an undetermined amount of kelp. They fed 2 pounds of molasses because that primes the pump, the rumen pump, to get that sugar going on there and not produce lactic acid. And then you can see the grain consisted of wheat bran, ground oats, ground corn, linseed oil meal, soybean meal, rolled barley, coconut meal. Someone here was asking me about coconut meal during lunch as to whether I thought that was a good thing or not so good thing to feed. And the one thing about coconut meal that I know is it's not high in the alpha omega-6 fatty acids, which we have in excess of. It's high in the medium chain and long chain saturated fatty acids, including lauric acid. And it could very well be that supplementing a ration with coconut may not impact CLA at all and may not impact alpha omega-3 concerns at all. And you see they had hominy feed, which is basically sprouted corn. And salt and minerals consisted of 8% of the grain. So this is 1952, and I thought, so I'm reading on in the book, I'm trying to figure out what did they do? How did this happen? Because nobody's getting this kind of nutrient density. You can get this kind of a ration put together to yield that kind of milk and butter fat. You go into this book and you find out what they were doing was they were using the Albrecht method on their soils. They used sulfur, they used boron, they used high calcium lime, they used rock phosphate. This is what they fertilized that Washington State farm with. Conversely, today, in the same state, I was there a number of years ago doing some work out there, and I was invited to come on this eastern Washington. This is western Washington State, east of the Cascades, not too far from Seattle. Up near Pasco, Washington, I was asked to come on a farm that had problems, and he had heard about me through some guy in the western part of the state that was using a few products that we were providing. And one of them was this Dynamine clay, which is this high calcium magnesium Montmorillonite clay. And he called me on the phone and said that I'm having some health problems with these cattle. He was a transplant, like many of them are, from the Chino Valley of California, where they're cannibalizing valuable real estate and translating it into $9 and $10 million dairies in the high desert area. And so he had this multi-million-dollar operation, and he says, I've got 900 cows, and I've lost a bunch of cows in the last couple of months. This is in the fall of that year. And basically the story was that he had 100 displaced abomasums, which is twisted gut. Twisted gut basically comes from killing the gut and gets filled up with gas and it flips upside down. So then he has to have the veterinarian surgeon come in and do a surgery on these animals where they right up the gut and they anchor it down to the perinatal wall. And then what happens, that's $200 a shot. So it's $20,000 in surgery bills in 2 months. And then what happens is when you anchor that cavity, or excuse me, that rumen down to the perinatal wall, the rumen in the whole digestive system is very muscular. It wants to rock and roll. Part of the way it digests food is to shake it up and move it and squish it and tumble it and everything else. Well, when you anchor it down, you don't get that tone anymore. You don't get that musculature, so you get this flaccidity. And that flaccidity makes that muscle go weak. It's use it or lose it. So those muscles go weak, and the efficiency of the rumen decreases to the point where he eventually had to cull out 66 out of the 100 cows, sold them for $300 a piece, replaced them with $1,400 cows, so let's say $1,000 there. So 66 times 1,000 is 66,000, plus the 20,000 for the surgery, plus the medical bills, plus the milk that he had to throw away when he was using drugs. So I ended up going up there about 3 months later, and he ended up asking me on the phone, what do I do? And I said, well, what are you feeding? Well, he was feeding over 50 pounds of grain, and he was feeding a whopping amount of this 30% alfalfa silage. Well, one of the tricks of the trade in making hay is everybody's still programmed and indoctrinated into believing that you buy hay on crude protein. When in fact, hopefully what you'll hear after these 2 days is that you never want to buy hay on crude protein, and you don't want to balance a ration based on crude protein, because crude protein doesn't measure protein at all. All it measures is nitrogen. So what he was buying was 30% crude protein alfalfa lucerne hay that he made into silage, actually into haylage. And the trick of the trade with the hay growers out there that want to sell this stuff on crude protein is they dribble ammonium nitrate on right before harvesting, which bumps up the CP very effectively. And now you've got a more valuable product that's worthless. because you really don't have those amino acids there. So this guy was feeding this 30% lucerne and all this grain and all this silage to the point that he was actually killing this ecosystem that we call the rumen. Well, I finally ended up having to get the right information. If you ever really want to get the right information, always go to the Mexican herdsman. He knows the cows. The farm manager, he's a businessman, or so he thinks, and he's got 2 PhD nutritionists consulting for him, plus at least 1 or 2 veterinarians that are telling him what to do. And I said, well, what does your feed nutrition say? Well, he's bovine growth hormoning the cows, milking them 3 times a day, and he had 90 pounds of milk per day out of these cows, and he nailed that 90 pounds on the wall, and that was his benchmark, and he wasn't going to budge from that. And yet we know Amish farmers that are on a 70% dry matter intake, forage ration, milking twice a day with no BGH at 70 pounds of milk. Who's making more money? Who's having more fun? You know, it just doesn't add up. I mean, I don't know what books these guys are reading. They're not reading these books, I'll tell you that. They're listening to the experts who know more and more about less and less until they finally have discovered everything about nothing. So the herdsman was telling me that these animals were so uncomfortable, they were lapping up gravel because they were looking for a buffer. And they got so much gravel, and then they had to call the vets back in there to do rectals to remove the impacted stones out of the colon of these cows because they were so impacted. And yet this guy was, you know, straight ahead on that software program saying you could balance that ration, make 90 pounds of milk a day, and supposedly make some money at this. So I always say, if they're insistent on governing your operations this way with this kind of consulting, get them on the note. Have them sign on the promissory note. Get them on the liability. Then let's see whether or not they're going to give you the kind of advice that seems to make everybody but the producer all this income. And so anyway, I told him, I said, listen, what we're going to do. We're going to put this Dynamine in there. It's a Band-Aid, and Band-Aids are expensive. They're not solutions to the problems. All they are is Band-Aids. And I said, but that's what you want, so that's what you're going to get, because you don't want to change, so you're going to have to Band-Aid this thing. So he Band-Aided it with this Dynamine clay, and he said, well, how much of this stuff will they eat? And I said, they'll eat 1 pound a head a day. He said, my God, that sounds like an awful lot. I said, it is an awful lot. He said, what do they normally eat? I said, 4 to 6 ounces. Well, then they'll never eat 1 pound. I said, they'll eat 1 pound a day. They ate 15 ounces per head a day, and they practically killed the herdsman when he came out there with the minerals to put it out there. Free choice. They practically ran him over to get it. And I said, and feed them at least 2 pounds of molasses. And they could have used more a day. And so anyway, the long story short was he stopped this LDA problem. It went away. And he had another problem in there called high somatic cell count, which is an elevated white count that shows up in the milk. And I said, you can't really deal with the elevated cell count until you put out the fire in the rumen, because you got all this stress and you got the immune system being suppressed. It's no wonder why you've got this elevated chronic cell count. So after we got the problem in the rumen somewhat rectified, I said, now let's treat the immune system with injectable vitamin A, D, and E, injectable muci, which is selenium and vitamin E, and this other colostrum serum, which is antibodies, and those three products. And I said, and just treat the animals that are above 350,000 on the somatic cell count test. Because what happened was he was ready to sue D. Laval. Because D. Laval just put a brand new multi-million-dollar milking equipment company, and he couldn't get his cell count down. He was blaming that the milking equipment was causing stress on the udders, and that he was missing his premium, a bonus when you get the cell count below a certain level, because above that, basically the cheese yields go down, and you're selling pretty much a mixture of milk and pus at that point. So you got a premium, see? And when you get that cell count below about 300,000, and everybody's always shooting for 100,000. Well, he couldn't get it below, so he was missing quite a bit of bucks per month, especially on 900,000 cows. So he was ready to sue the milking equipment company, and I said, let's put the fire out in the cows, treat these animals with these immune augmentive injectables, no drug residue, no side effects on the animals. Let's see what happens. In 96 to 97% of the cows that were treated, we dropped the cell counts right below, almost to the floor. We got way below the threshold of 350,000, got way down there, and this guy was absolutely amazed that this could be happening. And then he was so amazed, he ended up talking to the experts who said, there is no way what you did could have made that much difference. No way. It's too simple. It's too simple. It's just nature. It's just common sense. You know, you can't use common sense because this guy's paying a lot of money. So probably the best thing that could have happened is this guy could have got a bill for about another $20,000 from the likes of me, and it might have been worthwhile for him to consider to keep doing it. To give you another example, there's in eastern Oregon or western Oregon, west of the Cascades, you have very high rainfall areas, 100 to 200 inches of rainfall a year. They'll tell you out there, grazing doesn't work. We can't make any milk. We have a lot of health problems. Can't get cows bred. Doesn't work. Well, you know, when a cow lays down a cow pie, you get this nice ring of grass growing around that cow pie, right? You ever see animals eat that bright ring of grass? They know it's loaded with urea, and they know it's loaded with imbalanced fertility. They won't eat that green grass down there. Well, in Oregon, what they've got there, they've got high CEC soils running around 25 to 30, very heavy clay soils, very low pHs, no calcium. They've got a need for calcium, they know it, but they won't put it on because the state university says, well, you need 5 or you need 10 tons of lime, and they can't afford it, so they put none on. And they fertigate with this liquid slurry manure that goes out there that literally makes the entire farm one big cow pie. And then they cut that forage and they put it in silage and they feed this to the cows, and they wonder why they can't make milk and why they can't get cow's bread, because they're loaded with all this BUN and all this low nutrient density and poor quality protein and no energy in the grass, and yet they'll tell you grazing doesn't work. So this is the kinds of paradigms that that exist now, and all this information that we had from the past. People like Royal Lee, and people like William Albrecht and Louis Bromfield and Sir Albert Howard, all these individuals that did this hardcore work. Where did it go? Where did all the information go? This next slide is another great experiment. Again, this is one of my other great finds. 9 volumes of Randelay Farms. This guy here, anybody weld in here? This is the guy who invented acetylene, right here. He worked for Union Carbide. He was a chemical engineer out of North Carolina and got moved up to New York State. When he got transferred on his job, he bought a family cow because he wanted his family to have fresh milk. He loved the cows so much, he bought a herd of them from New Hampshire for about $35,000 in 1922. That was a lot of money in 1922. And he got into the Jersey. He had one of the top Jersey herds in the country at that time. And he decided to make his farm a model farm of experimentation. And he started working with Ohio State University. He started working with sanitariums that wanted milk to heal people. In those days, raw milk was a medicine and not acknowledged for same. They were curing tuberculosis with raw milk in those days. It wasn't causing tuberculosis. He was working with, those are the days when trace minerals were just being discovered. And when they were discovering these trace minerals, they would go out and use them. They would apply them on the ground. Things like iodine were relatively new. Things like, and if you look at one of the trace mineral talks, the next one I'll give you a sample of what their premix actually looked like in terms of the variety and diversity of minerals that they were experimenting with, things that they don't even put in the feed sack these days. But these guys were doing, from 1935 to 1959, they published 9 volumes of this research. And you just can't believe the kinds of things they were doing at their expense in conjunction with universities that were really trying to find out what the connection from the soil to the forage to the cow to the patient all meant. They were working with Francis Pottinger. Francis Pottinger was one of the medical doctors from Los Angeles that now the Price Pottinger Foundation is one of the organizations like the Weston A. Price Foundation. It was one of the first ones that started, and then the Weston A. Price Foundation started afterwards. But Francis Pottinger is the one that did the cat studies, where they took various kinds of processed foods and raw foods and fed them to different generations of cats. And what did they find out? They found out that after 3 to 4 generations of being on processed foods, cats could not reproduce. His message to us was, if we keep eating these refined, processed, denatured foods, we're eventually going to run into fertility problems in the human species. And now fertility clinics are some of the busiest clinics that you can possibly visit because of the fact that we're not reproducing like we used to. But anyway, this particular farm here, they did all kinds of experiments with raw milk to the point they were actually providing it to sanitariums in New York City. For that matter, one of the top sanitariums at that time and today is called the Mayo Clinic, which is one of the top cancer clinics around. And the Mayo Clinic at that time was very much entrenched in raw milk as a medicine for many of their so-called incurable patients. I'm tethered. Here I am. It's this Italian thing. I'm tethered. Anyway, this here, it happens to be a good mineral mixture for cattle to correct Bang's disease and breeding troubles. Bang's disease is another name for brucellosis. And they were curing this disease and preventing this disease, and also curing and preventing reproductive failure just using trace minerals that they were recently discovering at that time. And this is not shocking when you consider that Sir Albert Howard was doing the same kinds of things in Kenya, Africa, and he was saying that, as Albrecht said, hoof and mouth disease is as contagious as a stomach ache as long as the animals are well nourished. In fact, they deliberately challenged animals with things like brucellosis and hoof and mouth disease only to find out that these animals wouldn't contract it. Well, this guy by the name of Dr. Ira Allison was a medical doctor who was called the Miracle of the Ozarks. And he was called the Miracle of the Ozarks because the human counterpart to this illness is called undulant fever. And it was considered pretty chronic and pretty incurable. And so Ira Allison gave him this exact same formula here that they were giving cows to cure it. And they found out, lo and behold, 356 patients were completely reconciled of that illness with not a single relapse in 3 years. Nothing but trace elements, and they weren't even of the expensive variety. They were inorganic trace mineral salts. So this is the kind of stuff that they were working with 40, 50, and 60 years ago. And yet we've dropped the ball on all of that, gone on to drugs to replace all this, and it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger of a business. And by the way, Francis Pottinger was doing the same thing in LA. He was curing undulant fever in people in LA with that same formula. This is the ecosystem that I tend to focus on. I could spend a whole day just with this slide because what we're talking about here on these biologically run farms are managing ecosystems. Every component of the farm is an ecosystem, including the rumen, the other organs of the cow, the liver. In fact, I like the phrase, the farm as organism. And all the organs of that farm, including the people who operate that farm, the stewards of that farm. So we're talking about, this is an ecosystem called the rumen, and here's where things begin and end. If you don't deal with digestion first, everything goes south afterwards. So what we have here is this triangle. And that triangle either contains high quality protein, poor quality protein, or a combination thereof. This little piece here is what we call non-protein nitrogen, urea, nitrates, whatever you want to call it. It's not protein. It'll show up on this test up here. Crude protein is nothing but nitrogen times 6.25. So you just extract nitrogen, multiply by 6.25, you come up with crude protein. Why 6.25? Because on the average, all protein contains an average of 16% nitrogen. All protein contains an average of 16% nitrogen. That's the 6.25 quotient. So all you're finding out here is that this contains nitrogen. How much of it's this little triangle, how much of it's this big piece here, we don't know unless we look at other things, which is what I'll show you here in a second. But this much we do know, is that 60% of the true protein breaks down into ammonia in the rumen. That's a natural phenomena. 100% of the funny protein, I call that funny protein, breaks down into ammonia. 40% of the true protein is what we call bypass. In other words, it bypasses bacterial degradation in the rumen and is absorbed just like a monogastric animal like you and I absorb protein in the lower gut. Okay? Then we got to deal with energy. Dr. Albrecht always said two main food groups. You have go foods and you have grow foods. Grow foods are the nitrogen protein components. Go foods are the energy carbohydrate carbon components. So if you're dealing with soils, you're dealing with forages, you're dealing with people and dealing with animals, you're still dealing with the two food groups. So we need energy for that rumen because we're getting the ammonia is the protein raw materials for the microbes. And that's exactly what happens in the soil. These are the protein raw materials for the microbes. So ultimately we're feeding microbes in here. They need energy. Where do they get the energy? Well, if you've got high energy forages, you get these compounds over here. Sugars, pectins, cellulose, and hemicellulose, and some other compounds I'll show you in a second here. If you don't have that, you still got to provide energy or you start having, weight losses, you start losing milk production and so forth. And what happens is if you don't provide that, you end up having to rely on the only other source of energy, which is grain. Now, if this is poor quality protein and you produce too much of this ammonia, you get what we call overflow ammonia. And overflow ammonia ends up passing through the rumen wall, ends up in the bloodstream, and now you have this compound called BUN, blood urea nitrogen, or blood ammonia, which is a very toxic compound, and it's also found in monogastric animals, including people. A good holistic practitioner with the right kinds of symptoms would pull blood samples and check you for BUN, particularly if you're not digesting proteins very efficiently, you're going to start producing high levels of BUN. And what happens with BUN, once it ends up in the liver, its toxic alarm goes off and says, get rid of this stuff. Why? Because it feeds pathogens, it suppresses the immune system, it's highly toxic. All you got to do is be around the ammonia to know how toxic it is, just to smell a little bit of it. Your instincts tell you that you don't want to inhale that stuff. So if you're producing it metabolically, your body's going to get rid of it. Well, how's it get rid of it? Well, the blood flows through the liver. All the blood flows through the liver. It's filtered through the liver. Liver is a very forgiving organ. You better be glad you got livers because it's the most forgiving organ you'll ever have. And anybody at the pub knows that. So you got to make sure you take your vitamin B1. We've been eating vitamin B1 in this road trip. I've been trying to tell these guys vitamin B1 works, and Gary was saying, I'm not going to be doing a double-blind study on this, but I'm going to take it anyway. I said, well, and then Graham ended up finding an article just the other day saying that vitamin B1 can actually protect brain cells from damage from alcohol because it keeps the aldehyde conversion from being a toxic compound, which is what happens in alcohol to aldehyde. I digress, but anyway, I had to throw that in there just so that you had some fun with B1. Take B1, be my guest. Anyway, so this liver gets rid of this blood urea nitrogen by converting it to a less toxic compound called urea, and then the urea gets sent back into the bloodstream, and that urea then is converted in the kidneys to uric acid, and out the back end it goes. Well, this is a very natural process until this gets to be a runaway train. After you start producing high levels of BUN, and a couple examples of that, there was a Ohio dairyman I talked to at a grazing conference a couple years ago, and he came to this talk and he said, I really understand some of what you're talking about because I had an incident in the spring. I was using urea as a fertilizer to grow this ryegrass, and he said, cows were dying. And he said, I checked the milk urea nitrogen levels. They actually can measure this by testing the blood for blood urea nitrogen, or they can test the milk for milk urea nitrogen. It's still measuring this blood ammonia because it ultimately comes out in the milk. And he said, and we were losing cows. And so he said, what I did is I ended up feeding them molasses. It's the same thing the guy out there in Washington State did, because the molasses is soluble sugar. It's not starch. It doesn't produce the acids that the starch does. And so they can lick that molasses, put some energy on or keep the energy on, and balance the rumen protein requirements, which was really nitrogen at that point, with some soluble energy, which is sugar. Otherwise, his MUN levels were up to 27, and the normal level, the safe level, somewhere between 9 and 12. So he was way off the charts, and that's why his cows were dying. Interestingly enough, the same thing happened when I was in England in 1996, and dairymen were coming up talking about how their calves were dying, and they didn't know what it was, and the antibiotics didn't work, and the vaccines didn't work. Nothing was working medicinally until somebody finally used a Bayer test kit. You can sample the milk right on the farm for MUN, milk urea nitrogen, and they found out literally the calves were dying from the urea content in the milk from the dam, because the dam was eating all this high NPN grass. And it was literally poisoning the babies, and they were dying from that. Keep in mind that a calf is a monogastric animal. It can't decontaminate nitrogen the way a ruminant can. That's why you can get away with feeding a certain amount of urea to a ruminant, because these bugs that are in here are able to eat that and turn it into bacterial protein. So anyway, that's what happens. Well, an example of that guy in Oregon that said, I can't make any milk on this grass. He was saying, he was really confused. He said, I'm feeding this 24% protein silage, grass silage, and he said, and I can't make any milk until I buy some hay from eastern Washington State that's about 17% protein, and they come up in milk. Well, sure, what's happening is this liver is working overtime. It's working to get rid of all this BUN, and along comes some real protein hay, and he feeds that, and it comes up in milk, because all that energy that's used to decontaminate the blood is work, and work consumes energy. So all that energy that was consumed to get rid of all this junk that he buys, either with the fertilizer or with the feed, you're buying it one of two ways, and then you got to buy it a third time to get rid of it. 3 times you pay for that stuff. And then you have unproductive animals that you can't get bred back. When you consider the fact that in 1960 there were 2 million dairy farms in the United States, 2 million, and today there's less than 80,000. That's a 96% attrition. Okay? And what, to me, a real barometer of the sign of cultural decline and social decay is that when you have more police and more prisoners than you do have farmers. And that's exactly our situation in the United States. We have 2 million prisoners in the United States, and we have more than that in terms of policemen. We have fewer of that than actual farmers. 75% of the crop production in the United States is now produced by less than 400,000 farmers. See, and now today with the dairy industry, 3% of the dairy farmers are producing 40% of the milk, but not in Pennsylvania, because we have a lot of small farms that can't get big by virtue of who these people are. The Amish and Mennonite people are not going to have 500 and 5,000 cow dairies because it just doesn't work in their social structure. But we're like the 3rd largest dairy state in production right now, and our average milk size, or dairy size, I should say, in the state is probably around 60 cows. So there's 2 paradigms at work here. The future is whatever way the consumer wants to take and whatever way the producer wants to follow that consumer. And I can assure you, the farmers, the producers out of the 3% producing 40% of the milk are listening to the experts. The people who are milking 50 and 60 cows and 25 and 40 cows are listening to their customers. And they're listening to the customers who are listening to holistic physicians and who are also talking to one another about how you get well. And it's with food. It's not with this pus and this other crap that's coming out of these feedlots.